The wind carried the scent of salt and roasted coffee as Daniel Harris walked down Marine Parade, his boots clicking against the damp pavement. Brighton's evening sky shimmered in muted gold, and gulls wheeled above the seawall like restless thoughts. He wasn't used to this sort of thing, certainly not blind dates, and absolutely not ones arranged by a maid with too much confidence and too little tact. "Go on, Danny," his friend Luke had said, setting up a profile for him on some faceless dating app. "Worst case, you get a free burger. Best case, who knows?" Daniel had rolled his eyes. Yet now, here he was, collar awkwardly stiff, shirt freshly ironed, but still smelling faintly of motor oil, clutching a folded note that read, "Table 6, the Sea Lantern Café." The cafe itself was a narrow haven overlooking the Brighton pier, candlelit tables, old oak beams, the gentle hum of conversation. Inside, the air was warm, touched with cinnamon and sea breeze. Daniel looked around until he saw it, table 6 by the window. Someone was already sitting there. A young woman, mid-20s perhaps, her dark chestnut hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Her dress was a pale grey that caught the candlelight, and a thin silver scarf rested against her collarbone. Her wheelchair gleamed faintly in the glow, elegant and discreet. For a moment Daniel froze, unsure if he should approach. Then he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, is this table 6? He asked, holding up his crumpled note as if it were a badge of legitimacy. The woman looked up, eyes a clear shade of green, like polished sea glass after a storm. A small smile touched her lips. "It is," she said softly. "But I think you're not the man I was supposed to meet." Her tone wasn't cold, more surprised than disappointed. Daniel felt heat rise in his face. "Oh, right. Sorry then. I must have..." He glanced around, but there was no other table 6, no escape. She tilted her head, the smile deepening. "If you've come all this way, Mr. Harris, Daniel Harris." "Well, Mr. Harris," she said gently, "since my date doesn't seem to value punctuality, would you mind keeping me company for a while?" He hesitated, then laughed, low and awkward. "Wouldn't want your real date walking in and thinking I'm stealing his seat." She chuckled, a light sound like waves brushing pebbles. "Let him think what he likes. I am Grace." For the next few minutes they spoke of little things. Cars, books, the stubborn gulls outside. She told him she liked the sea because it never pretends to be calm for anyone. He told her that engines were a bit like people. They told you everything if you listened closely enough. And as the candles flickered, Daniel realized he'd forgotten the note in his pocket, the awkwardness, even the reason he came. He was supposed to be somewhere else tonight. But maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he needed to be. The candle between them burned steadily, even as the wind outside pressed against the cafe windows with soft gusts. Grace stirred her tea with the care of someone used to fragile things. Daniel, opposite her, wrapped his rough hands around a coffee mug that looked too dainty for him, a mechanic among porcelain. "So what do you do, Daniel?" she asked, voice warm but observant. He smiled faintly, scratching the back of his neck. "I run a small garage down on Lewis Road. Old cars mostly, the kind that grumble before they start, like people who've lived a bit." Grace's eyes glimmered with amusement. "So you bring old engines back to life?" "When I can. They've got stories under the rust. You just need patience to hear them." Something about that made her quiet. She glanced toward the window where the tide rolled against the pier supports, steady and unhurried. "I like that," she said softly. "Stories under the rust. People aren't so different." Daniel followed her gaze. The sea stretching out under the dim light, endless and a little lonely. "What about you, Grace? What do you do, if I can ask?" She smiled, almost evasively. "I read too much, drink too much tea, and occasionally help out with my family's company. Oh? She hesitated before adding, It's a property firm. My father runs it. I mostly draw up ideas, make things look better than they are. Daniel nodded slowly. So marketing then? Something like that, she said with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. For a few minutes they talked of harmless things. The best fish and chips in Brighton, the horror of British dating culture, how unreliable the train to London could be. But beneath it all, a quiet thread of connection began to hum. That rare feeling when words didn't need effort. Then, as she reached for her cup, Daniel noticed her hand tremble slightly. Instinctively he leaned forward. Let me... But Grace shook her head with a small, practiced smile. I've got it. He nodded, respecting the unspoken boundary. A silence settled, comfortable this time. Grace tilted her head, studying him. You don't look uncomfortable. Most people do. Why would I, he said. You're easy to talk to. Her lips curved. You'd be surprised how many people can't see past the chair. Daniel met her gaze. Then they're looking at the wrong thing. The words hung between them, simple and unpolished, and somehow exactly right. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass. Grace's smile softened. Maybe my blind date didn't get lost, she said after a moment. Maybe he just gave up too soon, so the right one could sit down instead. Daniel laughed quietly. Then I guess I owe him a coffee. You owe him nothing, she said, her eyes meeting his again. Calm, steady and alive with something he hadn't expected to find tonight. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir in him. Not attraction alone, but recognition. As if the tide had shifted, quietly, and he hadn't noticed until now. The evening had deepened. Rain slid across the cafe windows in silver threads, blurring the lights of the pier outside. Daniel and Grace had fallen into the kind of conversation that made hours feel like minutes. Stories of stubborn engines and seaside poetry, laughter breaking through the steady rhythm of the rain. Then the bell over the door chimed sharply. A man in a tailored coat strode in, shaking off droplets like a cat displeased with the weather. His presence seemed to draw the room's attention. Tall, dark-haired, the kind of confidence that made space for itself. Grace's smile faltered. Daniel followed her gaze and instantly felt it. The chill in her shoulders, the sudden stiffness in her hands. The man stopped at their table. Grace Whitmore, he said, voice clipped and polished, the accent of old London money. I thought this was a joke when you didn't reply, but here you are. Grace's color drained. Edward, no, he interrupted, eyes narrowing. You're having dinner with a mechanic? His glance flicked to Daniel, measuring, dismissing. Does he even know who you are? The cafe quieted. Cutlery stopped mid-air. Daniel rose slowly, the instinct to defend flickering like heat under his calm expression. Mate, he said evenly, you might want to lower your voice. People are trying to eat. Edward laughed, short, humorless. And you might want to remember your place. Grace's voice, when it came, trembled but carried steel. That's enough, Edward. You were late. This isn't your table anymore. Her words hung in the air, gentle but final. For a heartbeat, Edward stood frozen, then his mouth curled in contempt. Your father would be thrilled to know where you spend your evenings. Daniel took a step forward, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence. You've said your bit, now leave. Edward met his eyes, and something in Daniel's steady stare made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the kind of strength money couldn't teach. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, the door slamming behind him. The cafe exhaled collectively. Soft murmurs resumed, but the air between Daniel and Grace had changed. Not awkward, just heavier. Grace's hands rested still on her lap, fingers tightening around the edge of her scarf. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He wasn't supposed to be here. He's a family arrangement that refuses to end." Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I do," she said quietly. "My family, they think in contracts and legacy, not in people." He sat back down, his voice low. "Then it's their loss." Grace looked at him for a long time, the mechanic with oil on his fingers and kindness in his tone. For the first time that night, her eyes glistened, not from embarrassment, but from something dangerously close to hope. Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving behind a fragile calm, the kind that always comes just before a new storm. They stepped out into the night, the smell of the sea sharper now after the rain. The promenade glistened beneath the lamplight, and the soft hum of the tide filled the spaces where words failed. Grace maneuvered her wheelchair down the gentle slope toward the seafront, the rain still dripping from her scarf. Daniel walked beside her, matching his stride to her pace without thinking. For a while, neither spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, more like a shared breath after something tense. The air tasted of salt and quiet relief. "I didn't mean to drag you into that," Grace said finally. Her voice was soft, but carried the kind of weariness that came from years of managing other people's expectations. Daniel gave a small shrug. "You didn't drag me anywhere." I sat down. "My mistake." She laughed under her breath, a real one this time. "Maybe the best mistake of the week." He grinned. "You're assuming I make few." "I'd bet you make plenty," she said, looking up at him. "But you seem the sort who fixes what he breaks." He thought about that as they turned a corner. The pier lights shimmered on the wet pavement, painting their reflections in gold and blue. "Sometimes," he said, "things don't need fixing. They just need someone to stay beside them until the storm passes." Grace looked at him, her green eyes glinting beneath the streetlight. "Do you say that to all the women you rescue from arrogant men?" He chuckled. "You looked like you had him handled before I even stood up." Her lips curved. "I did. But it's nice, having someone who doesn't flinch." They reached a bench overlooking the dark water. The wind off the channel was brisk, so Daniel shrugged off his jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. She hesitated, then let it stay. "You must think my life's a mess," she murmured. He leaned on the railing beside her. "Everyone's is. Some of us just hide it better." A wave broke against the stones, the spray catching faint light. Grace followed the rhythm of the sea, breathing deeper. "I used to come here a lot," she said. "Before the accident, I thought the sea would sound different after everything. But it doesn't. It just keeps moving." Daniel nodded. "Engines do that too. You fix what's broken, but they never sound exactly the same again. Still, you learn to love the new noise." That made her smile, a quiet, thoughtful one. When the drizzle started again, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of polished metal bent into a spiral. "Something I made from scrap. Caught the light just right. Reminded me of waves." She took it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth edges. "You made this?" "Yeah. Not much, but thought it might suit someone who listens to the sea." Her eyes softened, and for a moment she didn't look like the daughter of a powerful man or the woman everyone pitied. Just Grace, with rain in her hair and wonder in her smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The rain began to fall harder, but neither moved. Two strangers sharing a bench by the sea, pretending for a while that the world outside that sound of water didn't exist. Morning light painted Brighton's rooftops in shades of silver and pale gold. A week had passed since the night of the café, and yet Daniel found himself glancing at his phone more often than he cared to admit. Grace hadn't promised they'd meet again, but somehow she did. Not through plans, but through coincidence, or something that felt like it. The first time, she was at the market near the lanes, admiring old vinyl records. He had come to fix a friend's van that refused to start. "You again," she had said, smiling as if fate owed her this small joy. "You following me?" he teased. "Hardly. Though if you are, you're doing it quite well." From that day, they started bumping into each other. At a small bookshop near Hove, by the pier at dusk, at the charity car meet where she insisted on learning how to hold a wrench. "I like understanding what you see in these things," she'd said, hands smudged with grease and pride. Daniel couldn't explain why it felt so natural. Around her, everything slowed down, like the world had less to prove. Yet beneath Grace's easy laughter, something heavier hid. He noticed the way her phone would buzz, and she turned the screen face down. The brief flicker of worry when a black car passed too slowly by. And once, while walking along the promenade, he caught her looking out to sea with a quiet ache that words couldn't reach. That evening, as the tide crept closer, Daniel handed her a paper cup of hot chocolate. "You ever tell me what you actually do?" Grace smiled faintly. "I told you. I help with the family business." "Yeah, but what kind?" "The kind that builds things most people can't afford to live in," she said softly, tracing the rim of her cup. "Whitmore Estates. My father runs it." Daniel blinked. He knew that name. Everyone did. The glossy developments, the luxury flats in London, the kind of empire that lived in newspapers, not in real life. "So you're—" "Yes," she said before he could finish. "That Whitmore?" He let out a low whistle. "Right. Well, I suppose that explains the fancy date invitations." She winced slightly. "It wasn't meant to. I didn't want you to treat me differently." "I'm not," he said simply. "But I get why you didn't tell me. Hard to find people who see you, not your surname." Her eyes lifted to his, soft, uncertain. "And do you?" He smiled. "I see a woman who made me hot chocolate on a windy pier." She laughed quietly, relief flickering through the sadness. Yet the question lingered in the salt air. Could a man from a small garage and a woman born into glass towers ever stand on the same ground? Later that night, long after they parted, Grace sat in her flat overlooking the water. Her father's voice echoed from a voicemail she hadn't played yet. "I hear you've been keeping strange company, Grace. Call me." She didn't. Instead, she opened her window and listened. To the same sea, Daniel once said, never pretended for anyone. But she knew. Some storms didn't come from the ocean. They came from home. The following week, Brighton's skies darkened early. A storm rolled in from the channel, wind snapping at the awnings of cafes and bending the lamps along the promenade. In Daniel's garage, the sound of rain drumming against the corrugated roof mingled with the faint hiss of an old radio. He was cleaning his tools when he saw it. A black Mercedes parked across the street, engine off, windows tinted. It had been there before, once in the morning, now again. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepped outside, and stared long enough for the driver to start the engine and pull away. Slow, deliberate. A warning, not a visit. When his phone buzzed that evening, he already knew who it was. "Grace, can we talk?" Not by text. He replied with one word. "Where?" They met at a quiet diner near the edge of town, one of those places where the walls smelled faintly of fried food, and the tea was always too strong. Grace sat by the window, her silver scarf draped neatly over her lap, her eyes tired. "You look like you haven't slept," Daniel said, sliding into the seat opposite. "I haven't," she admitted. "My father found out." He leaned back. "I figured. He's furious. He sent someone to check on you." His words, not mine. Daniel exhaled, a low laugh without humor. So that's what the car was. Her eyes widened. He followed you? Not him personally. Men like him don't need to. They pay others to do it. Grace pressed a hand to her temple, ashamed. I didn't think it would go this far. He believes you're after your money, Daniel finished for her, his tone flat. Let me guess. He thinks I'm using you. She looked up, eyes shimmering. He's wrong. I know. But he doesn't. And he'll make your life difficult. He has power, Daniel. Real power. I can't let you get hurt because of me. He folded his hands on the table, fingers still stained with oil. Grace, I fix cars that fall apart at 70 miles an hour. I don't scare easy. This isn't about courage, she whispered. It's about survival. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Outside, the rain came harder, blurring the world beyond the glass. Daniel watched it fall, his reflection a ghost beside hers. So what happens now? He asked finally. Grace hesitated, then said the words she'd been rehearsing all day. Maybe we should take a break. Just for a while. It hit him like a wrench to the chest, sudden, hollow. A break, he repeated, forcing the word past his throat. Her hands trembled. I'm trying to protect you. He leaned closer, voice low but steady. You're the one I don't need protecting from. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. He left money on the table, stood up and said quietly, When you decide what you really want, you know where to find me. Then he walked out into the storm.
Grace stayed behind, staring at the raindrops racing down the window, tiny, relentless, unstoppable. Her phone vibrated again, a message from her father. Come home. Enough of this nonsense. For the first time in years, she wanted to ignore him. But even the strongest tide can't turn instantly against the wind. The wind roared like a living thing that night. Waves crashed against the Brighton cliffs, spraying salt into the dark. Streetlights flickered, and the seawall shone slick with rain.
Grace gripped the wheels of her chair and pushed forward, her coat plastered to her skin. Every gust bit through the fabric. Every push burned her arms. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not even her father's driver, who had shouted after her as she left the house. But she knew where she needed to be. The lighthouse on the east cliff had been her refuge as a child, the place her mother took her to listen to the wind sing. After the accident, she couldn't bear to return. Tonight, she needed that song again. Or maybe she needed to remember who she'd been before the world tried to decide for her. Her wheels slipped on the soaked pavement. The ramp to the lighthouse was steeper than she remembered. Come on, she whispered, straining against it. The rain poured harder, washing the tears from her cheeks before they could fall. Then headlights cut through the storm. A van, too fast for the road. Tires hissing on wet stone. Grace tried to wave, shouting, Stop! But the wind swallowed her voice. One of her wheels caught in a gap on the wooden ramp. The chair jerked sideways, frozen. Panic clawed at her chest as the van's lights bore down. And then a shadow burst through the rain. Grace! Daniel's voice, hoarse, desperate. He had searched every street, every path he knew she loved, following nothing but instinct. Now he sprinted up the ramp, boots slipping, water flying with every step. He grabbed the handles of her chair just as the van skidded around the bend. Hold on, he shouted. With one brutal pull, he wrenched the wheel free and swung her clear of the lane. The van thundered past, horn blaring, disappearing into the black. They collapsed against the side rail, gasping. The rain fell like needles, relentless. Daniel's breath came ragged. Hers trembled between sobs and laughter. I told you not to come, she managed.
And I told you, he said, voice shaking. I don't listen when I shouldn't. She laughed weakly, the sound half a cry. You'll freeze. Not before you, he said, brushing wet hair from her face. The world shrank to the rhythm of the rain and their breathing. He held her shoulders firm but careful, his forehead resting against hers. I tried to stay away, he said. Thought it would keep you safe, but I can't do that anymore.
Every time I close my eyes, I see you. And that damned sea that keeps whispering your name. Grace's lips trembled. Then don't stay away. He exhaled a shaky breath, eyes locked on hers. You sure? Yes, she whispered. I need you more than I fear him. The storm howled around them, but for a fleeting moment it felt quiet, as though the sky itself paused to listen. And when Daniel kissed her, slow and steady in the freezing rain, the sea crashed below like applause. Far below in the town, lights flickered as the storm rolled inland. But high on the cliff, the old lighthouse glowed again for the first time in years. The storm passed with the first pale light of dawn. Brighton was washed clean, its rooftops dripping silver, its streets littered with leaves and the scent of wet earth. From the cliffs, the sea looked calm again, pretending, as always, that nothing had ever raged the night before. Grace returned home that morning with Daniel beside her. His jacket was still damp, hers torn at the sleeve, but neither cared. The great iron gates of the Whitmore estate loomed before them like sentinels of another world. Daniel stopped. You sure about this? Grace nodded. If I don't face him now, he'll never see who I've become. Inside, the house was too quiet. The marble floors gleamed. The ticking of a grandfather clock echoed down the hallway. Sir Edward Whitmore stood in his study, back to them, watching the rain slide down the glass. I hope you're proud of yourself, he said without turning. You disappear in the middle of a storm, endanger your life, and drag him into it. Grace moved her chair forward until she was beside his desk. Her voice was calm, deliberate. I didn't drag anyone. He came because he cares. Edward turned then, grey suit immaculate, but the weight of sleeplessness under his eyes. Care? Do you have any idea what people will say? Yes, she said. She war. They'll say your daughter found someone who doesn't treat her like a business deal. His expression hardened. He's a mechanic, Grace. Daniel stepped forward. With respect, sir, that's not an insult to me. For a moment, father and mechanic stared at each other. One built towers from steel and money, the other from grease and stubbornness. And somehow, they understood one another better than words allowed. Edward's gaze softened a fraction. You love her? Daniel nodded. Enough to fight every storm she walks into. Silence stretched. Then Edward looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw something unyielding in her eyes. Something that didn't come from him, but from the woman he'd raised to choose her own battles. Then you'd better keep her safe, he said quietly, almost to himself. It wasn't a blessing, but it was enough. 6 months later, the garden behind Daniel's garage glowed under strings of fairy lights. Old tires had become flower pots. The scent of petrol was replaced by roses. Grace wore a simple ivory dress, sunlight tangled in her hair. Daniel waited beneath an arch he'd welded himself, half steel, half wood, all heart. Their vows were small, their laughter real. When the local vicar pronounced them husband and wife, someone cheered from the workshop, and the gulls above answered as if to approve. Later, as the guests drifted away, Daniel wheeled Grace toward the seafront. The tide whispered against the stones. She stood slowly, holding on to him for balance. Her first step on sand in 3 years. It's colder than I remember, she said. He smiled. The sea keeps secrets like we do. She leaned into him, the wind tugging gently at her veil. Our story started because you sat at the wrong table, she whispered. And I'm glad I did, he replied. Sometimes the best things happen when Life gets the order wrong. They watched the horizon, calm, endless and forgiving. Somewhere in her pocket, the tiny spiral of metal chimed softly with the wind, the sound of something whole again.